All right, so today we're diving headfirst into this stack of reports, all about the economic impact of natural disasters in Brazil. You see the headlines, the immediate devastation, but these reports really dig into the kind of long-term financial shockwaves these events can cause. It's pretty fascinating stuff.
It's more than just a few damaged buildings here and there, right? We're talking about impacts that can ripple through a nation for years, decades even. And that's exactly what these reports bring to light.
You gave us two, by the way. One that takes a look at the whole of Brazil, and then another that hones in on the state of Santa Catarina. And just getting started, I gotta say, wrapping my head around how they even gathered all this data was a bit of a journey in itself. I mean, it's impressive.
It really speaks to the dedication of the researchers, that's for sure. Try to picture it. You're trying to get consistent, reliable information on the damage and the financial losses caused by these natural disasters, but you're talking about hundreds of municipalities, each one with its own way of doing things, and then you stretch that over 20 years. That's a monumental task.
Yeah, no kidding. It's like, I don't know, herding cats. But instead of cats, we're talking hurricanes and floods. And to make things even more fun, Brazil used to use this system called CODAR to classify these disasters, but then switched over to something called COBRADE in 2012. Honestly, just trying to track that transition alone had my head spinning.
And to top it all off, they couldn't even get their hands on reliable data before 1995 because the systems back then were all over the place. So they decided to focus on that period from 95 to 2014. That's when they started using these standardized forms called Avadan to keep track of all the disaster info.
Ah, yes, the Avadan forms. It's kind of like a standardized incident report, but for floods and droughts and earthquakes, that sort of thing.
Exactly.
But even with those, the researchers still had to go through like thousands of these things by hand, correcting errors, making sure everything lined up. It really hits home that behind all these statistics, all these data points, there were real people putting in some serious work.
Absolutely. But all that work, it really paid off. The first report shows, pretty clearly I'd say, that between 1995 and 2014, Brazil lost, wait for it, a mind-blowing 137 billion reais.
Okay, hold on. We can geek out on the numbers in a bit, but 137 billion reais? How do you even wrap your head around a figure that large? It's astronomical.
Picture this, a small country's entire budget just wiped out. That's the sheer scale of the economic damage we're talking about here. And remember, this isn't just the immediate damage, the buildings and crops and such, it's the ripple effect. Industries disrupted, tourism takes a hit, even government resources get stretched thin. It's far-reaching.
Right. It's like 1 minute you have a hurricane, the next minute you're not just rebuilding houses, you're rebuilding entire supply chains, transportation networks, everything. The money that can go into schools, to hospitals, it's diverted to disaster recovery. It throws everything off balance.
Exactly. And that's precisely why understanding these numbers, really grasping what they mean, is so important. This isn't just an academic exercise. It's about using this knowledge to make smart decisions. Where do we allocate resources? What kind of infrastructure do we prioritize? How do we prepare for these events in a way that makes us more resilient? It's about taking action.
So we're not just reading these reports to depress ourselves with doom and gloom, right? This is about figuring out how to build a more resilient future. For Brazil, sure, but also for the world, really. This is a global issue we're talking about here.
100%, and that takes us to a critical question.
Yeah.
Are there specific areas, regions that are particularly vulnerable? And if so, how does that vulnerability play out in the real world? How does it manifest?
And wouldn't you know it, that leads us perfectly to our second report, the one about Santa Catarina. So buckle up, everyone, because we're about to go even deeper down the rabbit hole. And trust me, this is where things get really interesting. Okay, so we've talked about the big picture in Brazil, how natural disasters can really throw a wrench in the economy. But now I kind of want to zoom in a bit, a little more specific.
Yeah.
And that's where this second report comes in, the one about Santa Catarina. I'm really curious to see how those national trends we talked about, how they actually play out in a particular region.
Yeah, and Santa Catarina, it's a really interesting case study, because they're not just reliant on one thing economically speaking. You've got industry, you've got agriculture, tourism, all big players in their economy.
Which I imagine means they're exposed to a wider range of risks, right? Like a drought might hit their agricultural sector hard, but then a coastal storm that could really slam their tourism industry, maybe even shipping too. It's like a triple whammy of vulnerability.
Yeah, exactly. You hit the nail on the head. And that's where this report on Santa Catarina gets really interesting. It digs into the specifics of how these different disasters, how they've actually impacted the different sectors of Santa Catarina's economy over that same 20-year period.
Okay, but before we go full-on data geek here, can you give us a little context? Why Santa Catarina? What is it about this particular state that makes it such a, I don't know, a compelling example?
Well, for one thing, Santa Catarina is, how do I put this? Kind of known for getting hit with a bit of everything when it comes to natural disasters. We're talking floods, droughts, landslides. They've even had a hurricane.
Wait, hold on. A hurricane in Brazil? I always picture hurricanes, swirling up north.
Yeah.
Like towards the Carolinas, right?
No, it's true. Back in 2004, a hurricane, they actually called it Hurricane Catarina. Can you believe that? It actually made landfall in Santa Catarina. Super rare for that part of the world. And the report, it goes into how much damage it caused, especially to their coastal infrastructure and, no surprise, their agriculture.
Wow, a hurricane. Okay, so freak hurricane aside, what else are we talking about here? I know the national report mentioned droughts being a major issue for Brazil.
Yeah, in Santa Catarina, they got hit especially hard back in 2004 and 2005, those 2 years of drought. Cost the state something like 2.9 billion, right? It's almost 3 billion.
Wow.
To put that in perspective, imagine their entire education budget gone in just 2 years.
That's wild. Okay, so between the hurricane and the droughts, 2004, 2005, those were not good years for Santa Catarina. But is that typical? I mean, are these mega disasters like a regular occurrence there?
Well, that's the thing about natural disasters, isn't it? They're not exactly known for their predictability. And while, yeah, Santa Catarina is definitely prone to certain types of events, those 2 years were especially brutal. And that actually brings up a really important point when you're trying to wrap your head around the economic impact of these things. You can't just look at averages.
Oh, interesting. So you're saying one absolutely catastrophic year can really throw the data off, make it look way worse.
Exactly. 1 or 2 really bad years can completely skew the data, make it hard to get a handle on the true long-term costs. It's more about understanding the full spectrum of possibilities what a region might potentially face,
Right. Makes sense. So it's not just about the average, it's about the outliers too. The worst case scenarios.
You got it. And that's another area where this report on Santa Catarina is so valuable. It doesn't just give you the total cost, it actually breaks down the impacts on the different sectors, agriculture, industry, services, paints a much more detailed picture than the national report could.
Okay, so this is all super interesting, but what does it actually mean for like a regular person, someone living in Santa Catarina, or even just someone like me who's trying to grasp the real world implications of all this data? What's the takeaway here?
I think the biggest takeaway is that it's all about making informed decisions. If you're a policymaker, you need to know where to allocate those resources, what kind of infrastructure needs to be prioritized, how to best prepare your region for whatever threats are most likely to occur. It's about being proactive.
So we've spent all this time, talking about billions of RIAs and damage, but I get the feeling we're still just kind of scratching the surface here, right?
Yeah.
What about the stuff that's harder to put a price tag on?
You're spot on. We can't forget about those long-term consequences. The ones that aren't always so easy to measure, but they're just as devastating, maybe even more so, especially for a region like Santa Catarina that's got all those unique vulnerabilities we talked about.
Right. So let's talk about those hidden costs. What are we talking about here specifically? I imagine it's kind of like a domino effect.
Exactly. Think about it. A major disaster hits, you see the immediate damage, the buildings, the infrastructure, all that. But then what happens, you often have this public health crisis that emerges. Natural disasters, they can lead to spikes in infectious diseases. You see more mental health issues, PTSD, anxiety, even chronic illnesses can get worse because of the stress and disruption. It all adds up.
Oh, for sure. I mean, you've got people displaced from their homes. They're under incredible stress, might not have access to their regular health care even. Yeah, the trauma alone must be immeasurable.
Exactly. And all of that, those long-term health impacts, they place a huge burden on our healthcare system, You need more resources, specialized care, and not just for a few weeks or months. We're talking potentially years of support. These costs, almost impossible to really quantify in any meaningful way.
It's like, how do you put a dollar amount on the emotional toll of losing your home? Or worse, losing a loved one? You can't. There's just no way.
Exactly. And that's the thing. These hidden costs, they often get overlooked when governments and organizations are trying to figure out, okay, what's the economic impact of this disaster? But just because you can't measure it easily doesn't mean it's not real, right?
100%. And it's not just public health either, is it?
Yeah.
What about the impact on things like education? Or even just like the social fabric of a community.
Huge impacts. Imagine schools are damaged or destroyed, families forced to relocate, kids' education gets disrupted, they fall behind, and some they never really catch up. That has a ripple effect on their future, their opportunities, and of course, on the community as a whole.
It's like they say it takes a village. Well, a disaster. It can really shake that village to its core.
And let's not forget about the environmental damage either, right? Natural disasters, they pollute water sources, damage entire ecosystems, and sometimes you have harmful substances released into the environment. These are consequences that we're dealing with for years, decades even. It impacts our health, the natural world, it's all connected.
So we're talking about this whole web of interconnected impacts: public health, education, social cohesion, the environment. Honestly, it's a bit overwhelming when you really start to think about it.
It is. But the thing is, the takeaway shouldn't be despair. It should be, how do we be more proactive? These reports, they highlight how urgently we need a different approach to disaster planning. It's not enough to just rebuild buildings. We need to rebuild lives, rebuild communities, and do it in a way that's sustainable for the long haul.
So how do we do that? What does that look like in practice? We know there are these hidden costs now, so what can we do with that knowledge?
It starts with acknowledging those costs. Recognizing that the true cost of these disasters goes beyond just what we can see, what we can easily measure. And then it's about investing in things like more resilient infrastructure, early warning systems, community-based disaster preparedness programs, things that will actually make a difference.
So it's about shifting from a reactive approach to a more preventative one, building resilience into the system from the ground up.
Precisely. And this isn't just on governments or big organizations either, you know. We can all play a role in making our communities more resilient. Be informed, be prepared, and be engaged in finding solutions.
This whole conversation has really been an eye-opener, I gotta say. We started with a couple of reports, and now look where we are. It's a whole world of complexity, all interconnected, and it really makes you think. If I'm walking away with one thing from this deep dive, it's that the true cost of these disasters, it goes way beyond those initial headlines.
Well,
way beyond.
could have said it better myself. The numbers are important, sure, but it's those human stories, the long-term consequences. Those are the things that really drive home how urgent this is. It's time to build a more resilient future for everyone.
Well said. And on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. Hopefully you found it insightful, maybe even a little inspiring. It's a lot to think about, but hey, that's what we're here for, right? Until next time, stay curious, everyone.